On March 13th of this year, my business manager, Carolyn, forwarded an email to me, and she just added the words, Brussels? The email that she forwarded had gone to our business account. It came from someone named Alex at the digital outreach section of NATO's Office of Strategic Communications, or as they tell me, OSC. In brief, the email was inviting me to come to NATO headquarters in Brussels on April 2nd as part of a program to mark NATO's 77th anniversary. I am often surprised at the opportunities I get because I'm the history guy, especially since in the end I'm really just a guy who makes videos in his basement, but an invitation to come to NATO headquarters to meet the Secretary General of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was unexpected. But the brochure attached to the email said that the program has been around since 2022 and is engaged with over 100 content creators. So then I was offended because why did it take so long to get to me? Now, NATO wasn't paying me for the visit, but they were paying for the visit, which means I was getting a free trip to Brussels, which is cool by any standard. But my schedule was really busy at the time, and I had a very short period of time to decide whether I could fit this in. And I'll take a moment here, a little bit of a caveat. Just by posting a couple of photos online of this trip, some people complained loudly that by going to NATO headquarters, I was just subjecting myself to propaganda. Someone even suggested I was going to become a tool of the CIA. The CIA is not really specifically affiliated with NATO, and I have no idea why on earth the CIA would want the history guy, so I think I can write that one off. But this was, if propaganda is not the right word, this was certainly public relations. I mean, the term Office of Strategic Communications implies that there is at least some, motive on their part involved. The brochure says that the purpose of the program is to drive high-impact visibility of NATO among the target youth audience. And yes, the fact that there was an agenda did give me some concern. So once again, NATO did not pay me to be there. This is not a paid advertisement. I have no contract with NATO regarding what I'm going to present about this visit. And NATO didn't ask for any sort of prior review of anything that I was going to make. All editorial decisions are made by me. They're not being made by NATO. But also, give me some credit. I understand why NATO had me there. I understand that the digital outreach section of the Office of Strategic Communications was hoping to get a specific kind of message out and that they were going to control what I was going to see. And I'm a critical thinker. I'm able to take this entire presentation in the context of which it was offered and approach it, because this is really just another form of press outreach, and approach it as we would hope a professional journalist would approach, with a certain degree of skepticism, or as I have always tried to be, with the objectivity of a historian that's just trying to present history that deserves to be remembered. But this is an important and venerable alliance that has played an important and often not well understood role in history, and it would be foolish to ignore this opportunity to see inside the organization and create relationships with their internal historians and archivists. So that brings me to a point where I should address the elephant in the room, given current events, because right now the United States has a rather large elephant who likes to stomp around the room. And I'm not saying that as a criticism. I'm just saying that our president likes to be heard, and the elephant stomping this time almost stomped on me, because at the same time I was getting on the airplane to Brussels, the president was being quoted in the Guardian magazine saying that he was rethinking whether the United States should participate in NATO. And that's, of course, a big deal. And that led, when I posted just those few photographs, to rather spirited discussion online about the nature and purpose of NATO and whether you like or don't like NATO. It's funny because at Christmas, there were some people who stomped and wailed and insisted that they could never respect me again because I went to the Christmas party at a time when Donald Trump was president. And now here's other people, presumably from the opposite side of the political spectrum, who are stomping and wailing and telling me that they could never respect me again because I went to NATO headquarters at a time when the U.S. is, I guess, arguing with NATO. But understand, I was making no political statement whatsoever by going to NATO headquarters at this time. I was simply there for the history. If you are mad at NATO for whatever reason, or mad at President Trump for whatever reason, or whatever, I'm not responsible for that. And for pity's sake, no part of the decision of how the United States does or does not participate with NATO is impacted by the fact that the history guy went to Brussels this week. When asked about current events, I like to say, I'm a historian. Ask me in 20 years.
So if you want to argue about that in the comments, if you want to yell about the president or NATO or anything like that, you're welcome to, as long as you're respectful. If you get a little too feisty, I might remove your comments. But also remember that there's about 1 billion other places online where you can yell and argue about politics.
So, tucked in between 3 trips to New York and my daughter getting her wisdom teeth out, I hopped on a plane, or rather 2 planes, and after some of the typical difficulties of travel, I arrived at Brussels Airport around 10 in the morning on April 1st. But it was April Fool's Day, and ha ha to me, my bag was still in Chicago. April Fools.
Now, luckily, I had gotten in rather early. My flight landed about 10 in the morning, and there wasn't anything scheduled on the first until dinner, which was at 7 that night, which gave me a good deal of time. I had originally thought I might use that time to, say, go visit a museum or maybe even go all the way down to the Waterloo battlefield. It turned out that that was a bit optimistic for a seriously jet lagged history guy.
But not wanting to meet the Secretary General of an organization of 32 nations that protects around 1 billion people, still wearing the same clothes that I'd flown through the night in, I did run down to the shopping district to buy a new suit of clothes and fresh underwear. These are the clothes. You'll have to use your imagination on the underwear. I also bought a bunch of chocolate because Belgium is good at chocolate, and I had made certain promises to certain people that made me wonder if I would be welcome if I returned home without chocolate. That evening, happy that I was finally wearing fresh underwear, the group of history focused social media creators that had been invited to the event got to meet and have dinner at a restaurant off of the spectacular Gross Market or Grand Place. This is a lot of fun. I don't get to spend time with people who do what I do very often, but after some trout in tomato tarragon shallot cream, it was off to the hotel because we had a busy schedule the next day. NATO headquarters is a political administrative center, so if you were expecting tanks and such, well, sorry, not here. NATO's military headquarters is about 50 miles away. The building is quite large, some 250,000 square meters, around 273,000 square yards, along the main boulevard Leopold III.
I would love to show you photographs of security and what it looked like to go through security, or at least maybe the entrance to the building. But those are secure areas because of, they don't want to give people hints about how you might bust in or something. And we weren't allowed to take photographs. And I wasn't about to break the rules because I didn't want to be thrown in NATO jail. The NATO police seem pretty serious about their jobs. But suffice it to say that getting into NATO is more difficult than getting through security at the airport.
We all got temporary badges, and we're told that if we were caught without them, we'd go to NATO jail and never be seen again. There are a couple of monuments as you enter. We still couldn't take photos because it was outside and they want to protect the entrances, but our guides could take them, so we got these. These two monuments represent significant events in NATO history. These are sections of the Berlin Wall. The fall of the wall was certainly a turning point for NATO, as its existence had been seen as a Cold War entity, and the symbolic end of the Cold War was offering challenges to the organization's role. But also, of course, the fall of the wall might be seen as a victory for NATO in the Cold War. These are big questions for the organization, and I'll likely talk about some of these in historical context in future episodes. Across the path is this girder from the Twin Towers in New York. NATO is really, at its core, a defensive alliance that guarantees that an attack on one member is an attack on all members. And that is enshrined in Article 5 of the NATO Charter. But in its 77 years, Article 5 has only been invoked one time. Again, the fact that the Cold War passed without ever having to invoke Article 5 might be seen as a victory for NATO and its deterrence role, but the time it was invoked after the attacks on 9/11 also highlight NATO's role after the Cold War ended when new challenges had arrived. Inside, the first order of business was, of course, coffee. We were told that the coffee in the headquarters shop was the best in Brussels, not because their coffee is amazing or anything, but because Alex told us Brussels isn't known for good coffee. I don't know. I don't drink coffee. We were allowed to take photos of the coffee shop. It is a common area, but we weren't allowed to take any photos that included anyone who didn't agree to have their photo taken. So the fact that people were there meant that once again, NATO jail was involved. But here's the coffee shop later from the outside without anybody in the picture. The building is really large and it is really impressive, but we were only allowed to take pictures in a few public areas. But luckily, we did get a general overview from Nicholas Wynn from the NATO archives. This building just opened in 2018, so it's relatively new. NATO spent from 1967 to 2018 in what they called the temporary building. Yes, funny because they were there for 51 years, but it's across the street. The building is meant to symbolically look like clasped hands, with the fingers being the wings where the delegations are housed. Each member has space on these wings, but how much space depends upon the size of the delegation, with the U.S. being the largest delegation with 5 floors in one wing. The wings are connected by a massive central atrium that's called the Agora. These are stock photos because we were allowed to take photos inside for security purposes, and I still did not want to wind up in NATO jail. The Agora is intended to foster connection between the fingers, and it includes the room where the council meets, which is cleverly called Room 1. I can say that while we were there, something was obviously going on in Room 1 because the doors were closed and there were guards, and we were told that the room is understandably very secure, especially from electronic eavesdropping, so we couldn't even get close. And the threat of NATO jail was still very real, but here's another stock photo. But from there, we went outside the building through the door where important politicians usually enter the building. Our entry was apparently not worthy of a photo op, so we got in the side door, but this is where the flags of the NATO nations are, and it's generally the money shot of the headquarters. The flags are displayed in alphabetical order, but that presents a problem, as the names of the nations in English start with different letters than the names of these nations in French. And French and English are the official languages of NATO, so the order of the flags display shifts every week. One week by the country's names in English, and the next week alphabetically by the country's names in French. We were in the English order this week, so Belgium was first and the US was last in order. This is where the sculpture called the NATO Star by sculptor Raymond Hubrix, don't get mad at me if I got that wrong, is displayed. Originally installed at the temporary headquarters in 1977, it's an impressive 23 feet tall, and only the very most important and ruggedly handsome people are allowed to be photographed with it. The sculpture is a stylized image of the NATO star. The NATO symbol is the 4-pointed star, which represents a compass symbolizing the path towards peace. The star is housed in a circle representing unity, and the star specifically signifies the transatlantic link of the organization. In the middle of the circle of flags is this monument, which was donated by Denmark and dedicated at the old building in 2009 before being moved here. It commemorates those who have died in NATO service, paying tribute to their sacrifice and serving as a reminder of the consequences of NATO decisions. More than 3,600 personnel have died to date in NATO operations.
Back inside, it was a full day. We had a number of presentations from a number of different people from around NATO. A lot of that is going to work its way to future episodes of the History Guide, but we did get some time with people from the Office of Strategic Communications, who essentially told us that they have come to realize that many people today don't get their news from traditional sources. And since their office is really like press outreach, they've decided that we humble social media personalities, I mean, we didn't add it all up, but I mean, around the table there, we had, well in excess of 10 million subscribers combined, have become essential to their outreach, especially, they say, to younger audiences, because someone apparently forgot to tell them how old I am.
We got lunch in the cafeteria. This was my lunch, and it's certainly better food than what I got in the college cafeteria. The building serves some 3,600 people, has facilities from a gift shop to a fitness center. After lunch, we had time with Dr. Jeff Bredeau, the Deputy Historical Advisor to SHAPE, Supreme Headquarters for Allied Powers Europe, which is NATO's military organization. The organization was activated on April 2nd, 1951, so we were meeting on the 75th anniversary of the organization's activation. Dwight Eisenhower was brought back from retirement to become the first commander, called the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, or SACEUR. Dr. Bredeau gave an overview of the down and dirty NATO strategies through the years and how our tanks and nukes and such matched against their tanks and nukes and such. I'll talk more about SHAPE in future episodes. After that, we were joined by Mark Rutte, the Secretary General. I want to be clear here. On a day when Iran was firing missiles at NATO member Turkey, and a day after the President of the United States announced that he was questioning U.S. participation in NATO, the Secretary General spent an hour talking to a bunch of social media historians. He was quite candid, certainly didn't patronize us. He is himself a historian and still teaches history to a special secondary school on Fridays. Much of the discussion was about the state of history education and how NATO is taught in school. Talked about how he would teach about NATO.
I would explain to them that there was this collective view, and I would go back to the Churchill speech in December 41 after Pearl Harbor, where Churchill said that for the second time in the 20th century, the long arm of history reached out to the new world to come to the rescue of the old. And he then said, let's not make that mistake again after this war. And we didn't.
He also talked about why he thinks the U.S. has an interest in staying in NATO. This is presented without commentary. I'll let you viewers decide.
The good news, by the way, for the United States is that NATO is not only there to prevent a repeat of that mistake, but also for their own safety and security of the US mainland, because we make sure that nuclear submarines cannot be a threat to the, if they come from Russia, a threat for the US. We collectively can take care of the Arctic, we take care of a secure Europe. The US can project power because of making use of bases and allies here in Europe when they have to take care of issues outside NATO territory. So for all those reasons, there's also a clear interest for the US to be involved, more than just not repeating the mistake after the First World War. But
His perspective on the United States is not necessarily what I might have expected.
I'm absolutely convinced this is again the American century. So the 20th century was the American century, but I think the 21st century will again be the American century.
Yeah.
That country has a optimism and a energy and an entrepreneurial spirit which will make it unbeatable. And some thought it would be overtaken by China or others in the 21st century. I don't think so. I think I'm pretty much convinced that also for the 21st century it is the beacon of hope for democracies, for entrepreneurship, for free societies. Look at the latest technological inventions, AI, semicon, the Silicon Valley. In Europe, of course, we have fantastic companies in these domains like Mistral and others, but compared to the US, it is still relatively small in size and scope. In all these domains, I think in the end, the US is unbeatable.
But he also gave what I thought was an interesting perspective on the current discussion, in short, saying that NATO and the US have worked through issues before. We'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, of course, always. But it's not new for NATO that you have discussions among allies, and that's what's bound to happen when you have different views. And again, that's the difference between highly scripted Communist Party conferences in the old GDR or in Hungary in the 1960s or 1970s, or in the Soviet Union, compared to what we have now, where you have people at the top of their lungs fighting for their views and others opposing that. And that also happens in alliance. But that's good. It makes us stronger.
He candidly answered all our questions. He talked about a few events in NATO history and took lots of photos. I might include more clips in future episodes. We got some time with Nicholas again, this time in a fun room. The former SecGen office from the old building has been reconstructed, including a desk that was used by several secretaries general and was originally used by Bernard Montgomery, who was the first Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe under Eisenhower. We got to sit at the desk and on the couch where they had photos of numerous important people having sat there. We got a nice overview of the archives, a relatively new, created in 1999, part of NATO. For decades, documents were just shoved in closets, and the efforts to organize, digitize, and declassify materials to make them available has been a massive effort that hopefully will benefit the viewers of the History Guy and teaching history in general. But we weren't allowed to actually see the archive, which includes classified material and is somewhere in tunnels under the building.
We also got some time with Alison Hart, who's with the Office of Strategic Communications and is essentially the NATO spokesperson. It was a ranging discussion, but she gave this on-the-record comment about how she hopes people see NATO. And again, it's presented here without comment so that you viewers can decide.
The whole point, at the end of the day, is to protect and defend every member of this alliance. Why? Because we're all democracies, we care a lot about our freedom, that's why we got together in the first place, that's why we stick together now.
Over the course of the day, most of the social media personalities were able to meet with some representative of the delegation from their nation, but the United States, which is again the largest delegation at NATO, could not find a single human being in their 5 floors of business who thought it was worthwhile to spend time talking to the History Guy. Not that I'm bitter. But in all seriousness, I really do wish that I had been able to meet with someone from our delegation, because it would have been interesting to hear what their perspective was versus what we're hearing from the people from NATO. But all day long, I was the only American in the room. And given the nature of the argument that's going on right now, that was at times a bit uncomfortable. But also all day long, I was the oldest person in the room. That always made me just a little bit uncomfortable. But it was interesting in all the time I had to talk to my fellow social media personalities from around the world. to hear their opinions about American politics, because they certainly seem to want to talk about American politics much more than I wanted to talk about American politics. It's never really all that good idea for an American to talk about American politics when they're in Europe. But they were actually far more confident about what's going to happen in American elections than I ever would be. But I respected their opinions. I like these people, and so I bit my tongue when I thought that they were well off base. They can have their opinions, but they don't live here, so what difference do they make, to be honest? And I do kind of wonder what they might think if a bunch of Americans sat in their country and offered their opinions on their politics.
My bag finally showed up at the hotel around 8 in the evening, just in time for me to leave the next day, but I did need the bag to hold all my chocolate.
So that was my visit to NATO headquarters. I learned a lot. I had a good time. I made some important connections and even some good friends, and you'll be hearing a lot more about NATO in future episodes. And I guess it was at least interesting to be proximate to these events that might or might not be important to history. I really don't know. Ask me in 20 years. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.